Suppose you have the printing presses for money for your town. Isn't that a great position to be in? Anytime you want something, you just go print out new dollar bills, take them to the store, and buy it and pay. Now, if, however, you print too many of these dollar bills and buy too many things, what you're going to do is your money is going to become so plentiful that it's going to begin to lose value. Prices in your town start to rise, you've got to print more money to buy anything, and before long you've got inflation out of control. Then nobody wants to hold money, and people revert to barter to protect themselves because money becomes worthless so fast as prices are rising. On the other hand, if you control the printing presses for your town and you don't print enough money, then there's not enough money in circulation to keep the wheels of business running smoothly. People have to go out and look for trading partners. They're going to start scrambling to get money. Interest rates are going to go up. Business is going to be hard to do. And before too long, stores are going to start closing and the town slips into a recession. See, you've got a fine line to walk, and now you've got some sympathy for the position of the Federal Reserve System, the monetary authority for the U.S. economy. Now, the Fed has to figure out how much money to make available so that we don't get too much and inflation or too little and recession. But underneath all of it, there's still that wonderful fact that the Fed gets to print money anytime it wants to buy something, and that the Fed, in some sense, gets its money for nothing. Now, let's think about where the Fed came from. In 1907, there was a severe banking panic in the United States because banks tended to print too much money. That is, when the gold was deposited and banks issued private currency, they would tend to issue too much currency for a given amount of gold. People, becoming fearful that there wasn't enough gold to redeem bank notes with, would make a run on the bank. The bank would run out of gold and would shut down. And when banks shut down, we got recessions and panics. So, in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act to create a central banking authority that would regulate banks and require them to behave in such a way that panics would be less common. That is, banks would have to hold reserves and banks would have to follow good business practice. The Federal Reserve System is organized as followed. There are about 4,000 commercial banks in the United States that are members of the Federal Reserve System. And together, they own the 12 Federal Reserve banks. The U.S. is divided into 12 Federal Reserve districts, and each district has its own Federal Reserve Bank. The presidents of those 12 Federal Reserve banks play a role in the shaping of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve System is overseen by the Board of Governors, 7 men and women appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And at the top of the pyramid is the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, appointed by the President for a 4-year term. That chairman gets to set the agenda for the Federal Reserve meetings and is always visible in the press, his or her every move scrutinized as the stock market and bond traders and everybody else tries to figure out if the Fed's going to tighten the money supply and push up interest rates or make money more plentiful, credit easier to get, and potentially create a risk of inflation. The Federal Reserve Open Market Committee is the most important monetary policy-making body. It consists of the 7 members of the Board of Governors and 5 members that are drawn from the presidents of the Federal Reserve banks. Each president is on the committee in some years and off the committee in other years, so that in any given year there are 12 members of the Open Market Committee. The Open Market Committee meets every 6 weeks to determine whether the Fed is going to make money easier to get and lower rates, or make money harder to get and raise interest rates. Now, you wonder, how does this work? How does the Fed have influence over the money supply? Later, we're going to talk about the specific policy tools that the Fed has to influence the money supply. But let's go ahead and start with the intuition of where money comes from and the Fed's role in creating it. Suppose the Fed wants to buy something, like a Treasury bill. The Fed wants to add a Treasury bill, that is a little piece of the government debt, to its stock of assets. In order to pay for it, the Fed prints money, maybe currency, and goes to the open market, pays currency, so that currency now goes into circulation, and the Fed gets a Treasury bill for free. So, the outstanding dollar bill is a liability of the Fed. This is a claim on the Federal Reserve System. And the asset that the Fed purchased is the Treasury bill. Anytime the Fed buys something, it pays with a liability that it created. And the liabilities of the Federal Reserve System are the base of the money supply of the United States. Now, let's think first of all about the things that the Fed might buy. What are the assets of the Fed? First of all, Treasury bills. The Fed owns about $400 billion worth of United States government debt. That's about 1/10 of the total national debt. And the interest on the debt that the Fed holds more than pays the expenses of operating the Fed. So the Fed is pretty much independent of the government. It doesn't depend on Congress for regular allocations of funds. Also, the Fed makes loans to insured depositories, that is to credit unions and savings and loan associations and commercial banks. And the Fed receives interest on those loans. The Fed also holds a lot of gold, and the Fed holds foreign currency. In addition, something else that's interesting about the Fed buys coins from the U.S. Treasury and eventually puts those coins into circulation by sending them to the banks that rely on the Fed's coin and currency delivery services. Now, how does the Fed pay for these assets? It pays, first of all, by printing money and putting that money into circulation. There's about $400 billion worth of currency in circulation, and the Fed put every dollar of it into circulation by buying something. Another way that the Fed can pay for stuff is by giving banks credit at the Fed. The accounts that banks hold at the Federal Reserve are called reserve accounts. So the reserve deposits that the Fed credits banks with, kind of like the checking account of banks at the Fed, these are a liability of the Fed because banks can come in and withdraw them in the form of cash or some other asset whenever they want. The Fed also has a special account for foreign central banks that it uses for doing foreign exchange transactions that influence the value of the dollar, and the Fed has an account called the U.S. Treasury General Account, through which the Fed does transactions with the United States government. Now, the most important two liabilities are currency and reserve deposits, because the amount of currency and reserve deposits that the Fed creates determines how much money banks can create in new loans by a process that we're going to examine later. The most important thing, though, is to see that anytime the Fed buys something, whether it's gold or a Treasury bill, the Fed is going to be influencing the supply of money in the United States. There's one more service that the Fed provides that's pretty interesting, and that's the service of clearing checks. Checks clear through the Federal Reserve's check clearing service, which is a network of computers and wires and member banks, so that if I receive a check from you and it's written on a bank that's not my bank, I take the check to my bank, and my bank works through accounts at the Federal Reserve System so that money is transferred from your bank to mine when it goes into my account. And that system is run by the Federal Reserve. The Fed also runs FedWire, which wires money among financial institutions when you want to make a quick transfer. And the Fed provides coin and currency delivery service, as well as an opportunity to make emergency loans to any bank that is insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We're going to be looking now at the specific policy tools that the Fed uses to influence the money supply.